Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're traveling back in time to discover the truth behind one of history's most persistent legends, the story of a tiny village that refused to bow before the mighty Roman Empire. Before we begin our journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy the stories we share here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's adventure together. If your image of ancient Gaul comes from comic books or films, where brave warriors with winged helmets and enormous mustaches spend their evenings feasting on roasted wild boar while their druid brews magic potions, history has some fascinating news for you. That version certainly exists in stories and laughter, but everyday life beyond the Roman frontier was considerably less glamorous, and contained far more mud and ordinary hard work. The Gauls were not waiting for adventure to find them. They were too busy making sure their families survived another winter. Life in Iron Age Gaul rewarded one quality above all others: usefulness. Charm was pleasant, and good looks were appreciated, but neither could thresh grain, repair a torn cloak, preserve enough food for winter, or stop the roof from leaking during 3 days of relentless rain. The Celtic peoples learned these lessons early because they had little choice. Survival depended on competence, not convenience. From dawn until long after sunset, their work rarely stopped. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams. Fires had to be kept alive because relighting one could take considerable effort. Bread wasn't bought, it was baked. Clothes weren't replaced, they were repaired repeatedly until the fabric surrendered completely. Livestock needed feeding, gardens demanded attention, and ale had to be brewed because drinking questionable water every day was an excellent way to become a historical footnote. By the time you congratulated yourself for successfully putting on both boots, a Gallic farmer had probably completed enough work to qualify for an entire modern productivity seminar. And it wasn't simply physical labor. A Gallic household often carried an astonishing amount of knowledge entirely in memory. The farmer knew when to sow grain, when to harvest herbs, how much flour remained in storage, which neighbor owned the wandering goat currently eating the vegetables, which child was developing a fever, and whether the smoked meat hanging above the hearth would last another month or only another week. There was no notebook, no calendar notification, and no helpful message reminding anyone that winter was approaching. Winter had an unfortunate habit of reminding people itself. Even among the tribal nobility, life was hardly one endless banquet. Chiefs and chieftains frequently supervised enormous territories while their warriors disappeared to fight rival tribes, attend assemblies, or pursue glory in distant lands. Someone still had to collect tribute, oversee livestock, settle disputes between families, inspect harvests, and make sure enough food reached everyone living on the tribal lands. The hill fort didn't magically organize itself. Despite what fantasy stories occasionally suggest, these fortified settlements were less like luxury strongholds and more like oversized communities that happened to have defensive walls. If something went wrong, hundreds of people could feel the consequences. This is where many modern assumptions begin to fall apart. The Celtic peoples were not passive passengers in history. They were farmers, planners, healers, negotiators, merchants, parents, and problem solvers. Their responsibilities were rarely optional, because there simply wasn't anyone else available to do them. Ancient Gaul had a wonderfully efficient management philosophy. If you were capable of doing the job, congratulations, it was now your permanent job. Annual performance reviews were replaced with something much simpler: whether everyone survived the winter. By the end of this journey, you'll probably discover something unexpected. The difficult part about living in ancient Gaul wouldn't have been the expectations of others. It would have been realizing that the Gauls could meet every expectation themselves, and they'd quietly notice if you couldn't. The rhythm of daily life. If you believe waking up before 7 in the morning is an impressive achievement, a Gallic farmer would probably have considered you halfway through your lunch break. The day often began long before sunrise. Without electric lights, people naturally followed the rhythm of daylight, but work couldn't always wait for the sun to appear. Fires needed attention before they died completely during the night. Animals expected feeding regardless of the weather. Bread dough had to be prepared hours before anyone planned to eat it. Water had to be fetched before the household became busy. There was no snooze button. The rooster was the snooze button, and he was famously terrible at customer service. For ordinary farming families, the morning could begin with carrying heavy wooden buckets from a communal well or nearby stream. Depending on where they lived, that might mean several trips every single day. Water was needed for drinking, cooking, washing, brewing ale, feeding livestock, and cleaning. Every drop reached the house because someone physically carried it there. Modern fitness influencers would probably market it as functional strength training. The Gallic farmer simply called it Tuesday. Once the water arrived, breakfast still wasn't ready. Grain had to be ground into flour if supplies were running low. Porridge needed cooking. Bread required baking or reheating. Cheese, onions, beans, or leftovers from the previous evening might complete the meal. Every ingredient represented hours of labor long before it reached the table. Even eating was the result of planning that stretched across entire seasons. Then came the endless maintenance that kept a household alive. Clothing needed patching because buying new garments was expensive. Wool required spinning before it could become thread. Linen had to be washed by hand using water, and soap made from animal fat and ash, requiring an extraordinary amount of patience. Meanwhile, children were everywhere. Some were helping, some believed they were helping, and history rarely tells us which group was larger. The work didn't stop inside the home. During planting and harvest seasons, everyone spent countless hours in the fields, sowing crops, gathering vegetables, collecting fruit, tending gardens, and caring for livestock. Chickens wandered underfoot, geese loudly announced absolutely everything, and pigs displayed remarkable confidence despite contributing almost nothing until much later in life. Every season brought different responsibilities. Spring demanded planting. Summer meant endless labor in growing fields. Autumn revolved around harvesting and preserving food before winter arrived. Winter itself became a careful balancing act of rationing supplies while continuing countless indoor tasks. There were no quiet months, only different kinds of busy. Looking back, it's tempting to imagine ancient Gauls as simply hardworking. That almost understates the reality. They weren't just hardworking. They were the engines that kept Celtic society running, often before everyone else had even finished waking up. The business of survival. One of the quickest ways to misunderstand ancient Gaul is to imagine that tribal chiefs made every decision while everyone else quietly nodded in agreement somewhere in the background. Reality was considerably less convenient. The Celtic household functioned less like a dictatorship and more like a business that desperately needed multiple capable managers. If one person stopped working, the entire operation could collapse with surprising speed. Unlike today, there was no insurance company, no repair service, no supermarket, and no emergency delivery waiting to rescue a family from poor planning. Every household was essentially its own small enterprise, and Gallic men and women were often its chief operating officers. A typical home had inventories to manage, food supplies to monitor, livestock to care for, tools to maintain, clothing to produce and repair, servants or laborers to supervise if the family could afford them, and children to raise into productive adults before they discovered creative new ways to accidentally injure themselves. Children, it turns out, have always been remarkably inventive. A capable household manager knew exactly how much grain remained in storage without opening every sack. They understood how many eggs the hens usually produced each week, which cow gave the richest milk, how much firewood would survive a harsh winter, and whether it was time to slaughter a pig before feeding it became more expensive than keeping it alive. That wasn't trivia, it was economics. Modern households worry about monthly budgets. Ancient households worried about whether February would arrive before the cheese ran out. Money itself was only part of the equation. Much of ancient wealth existed in the form of land, animals, stored food, tools, cloth, and labor. Managing those resources required constant attention, because nearly everything depended on the weather. A few weeks of heavy rain could ruin crops. A disease among livestock could erase years of careful planning. One failed harvest could affect an entire village. There wasn't much room for careless decisions, which is why practical intelligence earned enormous respect. In towns and settlements, families often worked directly alongside each other. Farmers farmed, blacksmiths forged, traders traded, and brewers produced ale that neighbors bought regularly. Market stalls were frequently run by entire families, with everyone handling sales as competently as anyone else. If a family member left for several weeks or months, the household didn't close, someone simply continued running it. Among the tribal nobility, the responsibilities became even larger. A chieftain's household might oversee dozens of servants, hundreds of acres of farmland, tribute from families, food stores, legal disputes, repairs to buildings, and correspondence with neighboring tribes. When warriors traveled to assemblies or joined military campaigns, someone still had to ensure the household remained stable, and that someone was often the family members who remained behind. So when people picture ancient Gauls as simply fierce warriors, history offers a gentle correction. They were also farmers, craftsmen, traders, and skilled administrators. Quite often, they were simply doing whatever needed to be done. And every so often, they were standing in front of everyone else, reminding their communities that somebody actually needed to keep the place running. The living library of knowledge. Long before smartphones remembered birthdays, maps remembered directions, and search engines remembered absolutely everything else, the Gallic peoples relied on a remarkable piece of technology, their memory. And it had to be good. There was no notebook hanging on the wall listing supplies for the week. No calendar reminding anyone that winter was only a few months away. No helpful recipe website explaining how to preserve meat or make cheese. Most ordinary people couldn't simply reach for a written manual. Even those who could read often lived in households where books were expensive enough to be treated almost like family treasures. Knowledge lived inside people's heads, especially the elders. A Gallic farmer needed to remember which field had produced the best harvest the previous year, when certain herbs should be gathered, how long smoked meat would remain edible, which hens laid the most eggs, which neighbors could be trusted to return borrowed tools, and which ones mysteriously developed permanent ownership whenever they borrowed a shovel. Some traditions truly stand the test of time. They also remembered family histories, marriages, debts, promises, feast days, local customs, recipes, remedies, and enough practical information to keep an entire household alive through changing seasons. For many families, the elders became the household archive. If someone asked how much grain remained after last winter, they knew. If someone wondered whether enough wool had been spun to make new clothing before autumn, they knew. If someone questioned whether the family had already paid tribute to the local chieftain, they definitely knew. Convenient memory loss was surprisingly difficult around people like that. Memory also meant experience. Every year added another collection of lessons about weather, crops, illnesses, childbirth, livestock, and human nature. Older people became respected not simply because they were older, but because decades of observation had transformed into practical wisdom. Young people often learned by watching them. Occasionally, they also learned by ignoring them first. History suggests the second method was generally more painful. Many remedies, cooking techniques, and household skills were never written down at all. Parents taught children, grandparents taught grandchildren, and neighbors exchanged advice during long hours of spinning wool or working together at harvest time. Entire generations passed knowledge forward through conversation and repetition. It wasn't a formal education, yet it was astonishingly effective. Today, we become mildly uncomfortable if the internet disappears for 20 minutes. A Gallic farmer could lose an entire written library and still remember enough information to keep a family fed, clothed, and healthy, because the most valuable reference book was already stored in their mind. So if you arrived hoping to impress everyone by recalling a few interesting facts, you might discover an unfortunate truth. They weren't competing in a trivia contest. They were carrying an encyclopedia, and unlike yours, theirs had already been tested by real life. The art of negotiation. If you've ever imagined the Gallic peoples quietly agreeing with everything their chieftains said, history would like to file a formal complaint. Ancient Gaul was full of disagreements. Families argued over land, inheritance, livestock, marriage arrangements, borrowed tools, unpaid debts, wandering pigs, broken fences, and whose sheep had once again demonstrated an impressive talent for ignoring property boundaries. Since most people lived in tightly connected communities where everyone knew everyone else, simply storming away forever wasn't really an option. You would almost certainly see the same people tomorrow, and the day after that, probably at the market. Arguments, therefore, had to accomplish something. A capable household member quickly learned that shouting rarely solved practical problems. Persuasion, memory, patience, and occasionally a perfectly timed look of disappointment could prove far more effective. History never records the exact power of that look. Perhaps scribes were afraid to describe it. Many people became remarkably skilled negotiators because daily life demanded it. They bargained with traders over prices, discussed tribute with chieftains, arranged marriages with neighboring families, managed servants, settled disputes among children, and occasionally reminded everyone that buying another horse before repairing the barn might not represent the strongest financial strategy. Ancient bookkeeping often happened entirely inside someone's head. Ignoring the person who remembered every expense was generally considered unwise. Within communities, reputation mattered almost as much as money. A family known for honesty found it easier to borrow equipment, receive help during harvest, or arrange favorable marriages. A family known for constant quarrels often discovered that neighbors suddenly became very busy whenever assistance was needed. Strangely enough, this remains one of history's more enduring traditions. People played a huge role in protecting that reputation. Every conversation at the communal well, every market visit, every gathering quietly strengthened or weakened a family's standing within the community. Words carried surprising weight. Once spoken, they traveled faster than anyone on horseback. In noble households, diplomacy became even more important. Chieftains welcomed important guests, oversaw feasts, maintained relationships with neighboring families, and helped preserve political alliances. A careless insult at dinner could create problems lasting years. A thoughtful conversation could prevent them entirely. Being gracious wasn't merely polite, it was practical politics. This is one reason ancient literature so often praises wisdom alongside strength. Intelligence wasn't simply attractive, it was useful. The person who could calm a disagreement before it became a feud might save their family from years of unnecessary conflict. Meanwhile, if you entered an argument armed with confidence but very few facts, you probably wouldn't enjoy the outcome. The elders remembered exactly who promised what, who failed to keep that promise, what happened the last 3 times someone suggested your brilliant idea, and why repeating it would almost certainly end the same way. In other words, long before modern debates included screenshots and receipts, they already had both. Only they were stored in their memory instead of their phone. Courtship and marriage. Modern dating often begins with carefully chosen photos, witty messages, and hoping nobody notices you accidentally liked a picture from 4 years ago. Courtship in ancient Gaul was rather less forgiving. There was no opportunity to create an impressive first impression online, because there was no online. There wasn't much room for pretending to be someone else either. Your neighbors had probably known you since childhood, your family reputation followed you everywhere, and if you claimed to be hardworking, there were at least 20 people nearby who could immediately confirm whether that was true, or laugh. Mostly laugh. Finding a husband or wife wasn't simply about romance. Marriage was one of the most important economic decisions a family could make. A poor match could mean financial hardship, damaged alliances, or years of unnecessary conflict. A good one could strengthen two households for generations. Naturally, the Gallic peoples paid attention, far more attention than many people probably hoped. A young person wasn't just looking at whether someone was charming. Charm was pleasant, but charm couldn't repair a collapsed stable or produce enough grain after a disappointing harvest. They wanted evidence that a potential partner was dependable, skilled, respected, and capable of supporting a household through difficult years. Could they work? Could they keep their word? Did other people trust them? Did they waste resources? Did they spend every evening in the alehouse explaining why tomorrow would definitely be more productive? These questions mattered far more than whether someone had an impressive smile. Even among the nobility, where marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons, people still judged character. A partner who was reckless, dishonest, or incapable of managing their responsibilities created enormous problems for everyone connected to them. Titles looked impressive, competence aged much better. Courtship itself usually happened under careful supervision. Families met, neighbors watched, and communities noticed everything. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. If two young people spent time together, someone almost certainly knew about it before sunset, quite possibly before lunch. Communities had an extraordinary communication network, powered almost entirely by people minding everyone else's business. This also meant reputations were incredibly difficult to escape. If you were known as hardworking, generous, and reliable, that reputation opened doors. If you were known for laziness, broken promises, or avoiding responsibility, people remembered. They remembered for years, perhaps decades. By the time marriage finally arrived, neither side was entering completely blind. Families had quietly observed one another for a long time. Everyone had gathered opinions, compared stories, and formed judgments based on everyday behavior rather than carefully rehearsed performances. Which brings us to an uncomfortable conclusion. If you think you could have charmed your way through ancient courtship with competence alone, history suggests otherwise. Eventually, someone would ask what you actually contributed. And unlike today, saying you were still figuring things out was unlikely to inspire much confidence. The strength that was always there. One of the most persistent myths about ancient history is that people spent their lives waiting for someone else to rescue them from one disaster after another. History politely disagrees. Most people were far too busy solving their own problems to wait for anyone else to arrive. In fact, if a hero did arrive unexpectedly, the first concern was probably whether there was now another hungry mouth to feed. Heroism is admirable, but it consumes a surprising amount of bread. The truth is that life rarely paused because the men were away. Wars continued for months or even years, pilgrimages took travelers across distant lands, and traders disappeared on long journeys. Some people never returned at all, whether through disease, battle, or simple bad luck. Life carried on regardless. Someone still had to milk the cows before sunrise. Someone still had to organize the harvest. Someone still had to collect tribute, supervise workers, repair buildings, prepare food, and make certain that children reached adulthood with approximately the correct number of limbs. That someone was very often the people who remained behind. Widowhood, while tragic, was not unusual during this period. Disease, warfare, and dangerous working conditions meant many people suddenly found themselves responsible for farms, workshops, or businesses. Remarkably, many succeeded. Historical records are filled with widows signing contracts, managing property, hiring workers, lending money, and defending their rights in court. Some became wealthier after their partners' deaths because they controlled businesses they had already helped run for years. The paperwork simply caught up with reality. Even noble families regularly stepped into leadership roles whenever circumstances demanded it. While warriors served their chieftains or fought distant battles, family members governed estates that included villages, forests, mills, and hundreds of families. Imagine managing an entire estate without electricity, telephones, vehicles, or spreadsheets. Now, imagine doing it while everyone expected the harvest to succeed. No pressure. History also gives us examples of people organizing defenses during sieges. They supervised supplies, encouraged defenders, negotiated with attackers, and occasionally took direct command when no one else remained capable. It turns out stone walls don't defend themselves, neither do frightened soldiers. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is assuming strength always looked dramatic. Most people never carried swords into battle or wore armor. They carried responsibility every single day. They endured exhausting work, harsh winters, failed harvests, epidemics, and constant uncertainty without expecting applause. Survival itself became an achievement measured one ordinary day at a time. So if you picture yourself arriving in an ancient settlement expecting to impress everyone with tales of modern convenience, you may receive a rather different reaction. The people standing beside the communal well have already survived 3 failed harvests, buried family members during an epidemic, rebuilt part of their home after a storm, and somehow still produced enough ale for tonight's supper. Compared to that, remembering to charge your phone suddenly feels like a fairly modest accomplishment. Practical wisdom. One of the easiest mistakes to make when imagining ancient history is assuming that because many people received little formal education, they lacked knowledge. Formal education and practical intelligence, however, are very different things. A Roman scholar might debate philosophy in Latin for hours. A Gallic farmer knew which cow was about to become ill simply by watching it walk across the yard. One of these skills was considerably more useful before breakfast. Knowledge in ancient society wasn't always written down. In fact, much of the most valuable information never appeared in books at all. It passed from parents to children, neighbors to neighbors, and grandparents to grandchildren through years of observation and experience. How long should cheese age before eating? Which herbs help to calm a fever? How could grain be stored without attracting mice? When should fruit be picked before the weather turned? Which family secretly watered down their ale before selling it at market? People remembered, especially the elders. They became living libraries of practical survival. Need help delivering a calf? They probably knew someone. Need to preserve enough vegetables to survive until spring? They already had a method. Need advice on raising 6 children in a house with 1 room and absolutely no privacy? They might simply laugh. Not because it was funny, but because they'd already done it. The partnership of marriage. Modern culture has given us a curious idea about ancient marriage. The warrior fights while the partner waits patiently at home, and together they somehow live happily ever after. History once again has other plans. For most couples, marriage wasn't the ending of a love story, it was the beginning of a business partnership. The moment a couple married, their list of responsibilities expanded dramatically. There were fields to cultivate, animals to care for, tools to maintain, children to raise, tribute to pay, food to preserve, and enough daily problems to ensure nobody had time to wonder whether life needed more excitement. Life was already exciting enough, usually in the wrong ways. A successful marriage depended on both people understanding their roles and trusting one another's abilities. Husbands often handled heavy agricultural work, construction, long-distance trade, or military obligations. Their wives managed countless responsibilities that were every bit as important, many of which continued whether the husband was home or not. Neither role worked particularly well without the other. This wasn't always about romance, it was about survival. The strongest couples were often those who understood each other's strengths. If one person excelled at managing resources, they handled the accounts. If another understood livestock better than anyone else, they made those decisions. Practical ability mattered far more than wounded pride. The harvest had very little interest in winning arguments. It simply wanted to know whether someone had planted the wheat on time. Many marriages also involved long periods of separation. Wars, pilgrimages, royal service, and trade could keep partners away for months or years. During those absences, those who remained behind became the household's unquestioned managers. Interestingly, very few historical records describe communities collapsing because the men had left. The people simply continued working. Letters from the period reveal partners frequently asking each other to oversee finances, negotiate purchases, collect tribute, or settle disputes while they were away. They weren't writing because they had no other option, they were writing because they trusted each other. That trust had usually been earned over many years. Marriage also meant sharing hardships. Failed harvests, disease, floods, and famine affected entire families. Neither partner could solve these disasters alone. Survival depended on cooperation far more than authority. Perhaps that is why ancient writers often praised qualities like loyalty, wisdom, patience, and diligence above beauty or wealth. Attractive people existed in every generation. Reliable people were much harder to find. If you picture yourself arriving in an ancient settlement hoping to impress everyone by announcing that you're the head of the household, you might receive polite smiles, then someone would probably hand you a shovel. Not because they doubted your confidence, but because confidence was free. The potatoes, unfortunately, were not, and your partner had already been waiting long enough for you to start digging. The value of reliability. If there was one thing the Gallic peoples valued above almost everything else, it was reliability, not promises, not grand speeches, and certainly not someone explaining how they were about to become successful once the stars aligned, the weather improved, and they finally felt motivated. Results mattered. In ancient society, almost everyone depended on someone else. A farmer depended on the blacksmith depended on the charcoal burner, the miller depended on the harvest, and families depended on one another. Partners depended on partners who actually followed through. If someone promised to repair the barn before autumn, everyone quietly expected the barn to be repaired before autumn, not during autumn, and definitely not after the first snowfall. The weather had an unfortunate habit of ignoring excuses. This constant pressure created a culture where reputation meant everything. A hard-working person became known throughout the community. So did a lazy one. Neither reputation stayed secret for very long. Communities were surprisingly efficient information networks. You might tell one neighbor you plan to fix the fence tomorrow. By sunset, 3 other neighbors were already wondering why it hadn't happened today. For people choosing a partner or continuing to respect one, these everyday habits mattered immensely. Did they finish what they started? Could people trust their word? Did they remain calm when things went wrong, or did they suddenly become fascinated by disappearing into the alehouse until the problem solved itself? History suggests the second strategy produced mixed results. The same standards applied inside the household. Respect wasn't automatically granted because someone happened to be the head of the family. Ancient literature, religious writings, and household advice consistently encouraged people to lead through responsibility, fairness, and diligence rather than arrogance. Authority without competence rarely impressed anyone, especially someone who had already completed half the day's work before sunrise. People noticed consistency, not just on special occasions. Every day, a person who quietly worked beside their family, helped secure enough food for winter, honored their agreements, and treated others fairly built something far more valuable than popularity. They built trust. Trust allowed households to survive difficult years. It kept marriages stable during long absences. It allowed people to manage estates with confidence while partners traveled, knowing both shared the same goals. Without trust, everything became harder. Even simple tasks. Perhaps this explains why ancient stories often celebrate ordinary virtues instead of dramatic heroics. Courage on a battlefield was admirable. Coming home and repairing the leaking roof before the next storm was equally admirable. One simply received fewer songs. So if you imagine arriving in an ancient settlement hoping everyone will admire your confidence, your fashionable clothes, or your ability to explain why something wasn't technically your fault, you may be disappointed. The people watching from across the yard have exactly one question: can people rely on you? If the answer is yes, you've made an excellent first impression. If the answer is no, they probably figured that out long before you did. Kindness and toughness together. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is assuming that kindness and toughness cannot exist in the same person. The people of ancient Gaul had to possess both. They might spend the morning comforting a frightened child, the afternoon helping an elderly neighbor whose family member had fallen ill, and the evening telling a fully grown person exactly why their latest decision was spectacularly foolish. Life demanded flexibility. The ancient world was not gentle. Disease arrived without warning, harvests failed, and winters seemed determined to last forever. Children often died young, and families lost parents, siblings, and friends far more often than people today can easily imagine. Grief was familiar, giving up was not an option. That constant hardship produced remarkable resilience. People learned very early that waiting for perfect circumstances was a luxury nobody could afford. If something needed doing, it was done. If disaster struck, people adapted because there was rarely another choice. Complaining consumed valuable time. The chickens, unfortunately, refused to care about your emotional journey. This resilience could sometimes appear harsh to modern eyes. Parents expected children to contribute from a young age. Teenagers worked alongside adults, and children learned household responsibilities years before they became adults themselves. Childhood certainly existed, it was simply much busier. The same practical attitude extended to relationships. A person whose partner repeatedly made poor decisions could find themselves carrying the consequences for years afterward. Every foolish purchase, every unnecessary argument, every neglected repair eventually landed on someone else's shoulders, quite often those of the partner. It should not surprise us that people developed little patience for avoidable stupidity. History is filled with examples of people warning their partners against reckless decisions, encouraging caution before risky ventures, and urging families to prepare for difficult seasons. Sometimes those warnings were followed, sometimes they were ignored. The record suggests that ignoring them had an unfortunate tendency to become educational. Even noble families displayed this determination. Chieftains' partners negotiated with neighboring leaders, confronted rebellious families, defended their interests, and protected their children with astonishing persistence. They understood that hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. Confidence was not reserved for warriors, neither was courage. Perhaps this is why so many ancient chronicles quietly admire people who remained calm during catastrophe. While panic spread through entire communities, they continued organizing food, caring for the sick, directing servants, comforting frightened children, and making practical decisions. Someone had to keep thinking clearly, usually, someone did. So if you imagine yourself arriving in ancient times hoping to impress everyone with confidence alone, remember one small detail. The people standing beside you have survived famine, disease, political chaos, failed harvests, and probably 3 neighbors convinced they knew better than everyone else. You would not be the first person they had quietly decided needed more work and fewer opinions. Influence beyond the home. It's easy to imagine that the Gallic peoples only held influence inside their own homes. History quietly disagrees. Across ancient Gaul, countless people shaped politics, managed territories, negotiated peace, financed armies, advised rulers, and occasionally frightened powerful leaders who were perfectly comfortable charging into battle but suddenly became much less confident when confronted by a determined chieftain's partner. Armor, it seems, offered very little protection against good judgment. Even ordinary people exercised influence far beyond their front doors. Community elders frequently consulted experienced individuals because they understood local families, remembered old agreements, and knew who could be trusted. Their opinions carried weight, not because a law demanded it, but because they had earned respect through decades of practical wisdom. Experience has always been difficult to argue with. At the highest levels of society, noble families became indispensable. While chieftains traveled across their territories or fought distant wars, their partners often governed in their absence. They signed official documents, heard legal disputes, supervised tribal finances, welcomed foreign ambassadors, and ensured the machinery of government continued operating. The tribe didn't simply pause because the chieftain was away. Someone still had to keep everything from falling apart. Many noble people also became skilled diplomats. Marriage connected powerful families across the region, meaning tribal leaders often communicated with neighboring rulers. They carried messages, eased tensions, negotiated alliances, and sometimes prevented wars before swords ever left their scabbards. That required intelligence and an extraordinary amount of patience. Imagine trying to convince 2 tribal leaders not to fight each other. Now, imagine succeeding. Some people even became military leaders when circumstances demanded it. During sieges, they organized defenses, rationed supplies, inspired exhausted defenders, and negotiated with attacking forces. Ancient chronicles occasionally describe people standing on defensive walls directing preparations while everyone else wondered how much longer they could hold out. Apparently, leadership looks remarkably convincing when everyone is depending on you. What makes these stories remarkable is not that people occasionally held authority. It's that many people around them accepted it when competence was obvious. The ancient world could be deeply traditional, but necessity had a habit of ignoring tradition. If the most capable person available happened to be someone unexpected, communities relied upon them regardless. Survival rarely cared about appearances. Looking back, we sometimes underestimate ancient people because they rarely wrote books celebrating themselves. Their achievements are scattered across legal records, royal letters, monastery chronicles, and estate accounts rather than dramatic autobiographies. Yet those quiet documents tell an unmistakable story. Again and again, when communities faced uncertainty, families faced disaster, or villages needed steady leadership, ordinary people stepped forward because someone had to. So if you believe the Gallic people spent history waiting for permission to matter, you're asking the wrong question. The better question is this: how many times did history succeed only because they never waited at all? The myth of the simple life. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. The further we move away from fairy tales and closer to historical records, the tougher the people of ancient Gaul become. This surprises many people because history has a habit of simplifying the past. Over the centuries, countless stories reduced people to familiar roles. They were either fierce warriors or simple farmers. Neither picture survives contact with reality. The overwhelming majority were neither, they were simply busy. Part of the misunderstanding comes from the fact that ancient society certainly gave people different responsibilities. Men generally fought wars, plowed heavy fields, and performed physically demanding labor. Women managed households, produced clothing, preserved food, raised children, cared for livestock, assisted with harvests, brewed ale, worked in family businesses, and kept communities functioning. Different jobs, not easier ones. In fact, historians often point out that the average Gallic person probably worked just as many hours as the average man, sometimes more. Especially during harvest season, when sleeping became something people vaguely remembered doing. Modern audiences also underestimate how physically demanding everyday life really was. Grinding grain, washing clothes by hand, carrying water, chopping vegetables, stirring enormous cooking pots over open fires, spinning wool, weaving cloth, gathering firewood, tending gardens, and preserving food required constant movement. There was no gym membership, life itself was the workout. Perhaps that explains why nobody needed motivational videos explaining how to stay active. Surviving until winter was generally motivation enough. Another myth suggests ancient people had no influence because they rarely appeared in famous battles or political speeches. But history isn't only shaped by people standing on battlefields. It is shaped by the people making sure everyone else survives long enough to reach them. Every successful harvest, every child raised into adulthood, every household that survived another difficult winter, every business that continued operating while its owner traveled, and every estate that remained prosperous despite years of conflict. Behind countless achievements stood people whose names never appeared in grand chronicles. Not because they lacked importance, but because writers often assumed everyone already understood how essential their work was. Ironically, later generations forgot. So when someone claims people of ancient times lived quiet, passive lives, they're usually describing an imaginary world that never truly existed. The real people of ancient Gaul were practical, intelligent, resilient, and astonishingly capable. Which brings us to one final uncomfortable thought. If you somehow found yourself transported back 800 years, you probably wouldn't spend much time teaching a Gallic farmer how to survive. They would almost certainly spend the first week teaching you, assuming, of course, you managed not to lose the family's only goat before breakfast. The lessons we carry forward. After everything we've seen tonight, one conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. You probably wouldn't struggle in the ancient world because of the hill forts or the plagues or even the complete absence of indoor plumbing, which deserves its own moment of silence. You would struggle because you'd be surrounded by people whose everyday abilities had been sharpened by necessity from the moment they could walk. For the people of ancient Gaul, competence wasn't an impressive personality trait, it was the minimum requirement for getting through another week. They understood seasons without checking a weather app. They knew how to preserve food that had to last for months, not days. They could repair clothing instead of replacing it, recognize the first signs of illness before it became dangerous, organize an entire household with almost no written records, and make hundreds of practical decisions every single day without expecting praise. If something broke, they fixed it. If someone became sick, they adapted. If winter arrived earlier than expected, they found a way to stretch the family's supplies. Not because they enjoyed impossible challenges, but because there wasn't another option. Modern life has quietly removed many of these responsibilities from our daily routines. We buy bread instead of baking it. We replace clothes instead of repairing them. We call specialists instead of becoming one ourselves. Need water? Turn a tap. Need light? Flip a switch. Need dinner? Someone might deliver it directly to your front door. The Gallic peoples would probably consider this astonishing. They might also wonder why you're still tired. That isn't meant as criticism, it's simply a reminder that people become products of the worlds they live in. The ancient world demanded resilience, our world demands very different skills. Neither makes people better or worse, only different. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden beneath all the myths. The people of ancient Gaul weren't extraordinary because they possessed superhuman abilities. They became extraordinary because ordinary life required extraordinary effort. Generation after generation, they adapted to challenges most of us will thankfully never face. Their strength wasn't loud, it was constant. Their courage wasn't always recorded in chronicles. It appeared in thousands of ordinary mornings that began before sunrise and ended long after darkness fell. History rarely remembers every loaf of bread baked, every child comforted, every roof repaired, every harvest saved, or every difficult decision made around a small wooden table. Yet those quiet victories built ancient civilization just as surely as chieftains built hill forts. So the next time someone jokes that life in the ancient world was simple, remember the people who lived it. Not because they were fearless, not because they never grew tired, but because every single day they did what needed to be done anyway. And if we're being completely honest, after spending 1 week trying to keep up with them, you'd probably be asking whether there was perhaps another.